So on July 19, 1951, 75 years ago, the University of Pennsylvania canceled its own television deal with ABC. How come? Well, let's rewind real quick to 1938. Penn televised a home football game, the first one in history. There were only 6 television sets in all of Philadelphia and all were tuned in. By 1950, Penn was sitting on a mortgage over $1.5 million for its own stadium, and the president sold the rights to every home game to ABC for $150,000. That looked to the rest of the college football like a threat. If Penn, an Ivy League, national name, no shortage of alumni money, could just sell its own games and keep the revenue, what's stopping everyone else from doing the same and undercutting whoever didn't? The NCAA stepped in and answered with a plan. One nationally broadcasted game a week, total blackouts on 3 of 10 Saturdays, and no team was allowed to appear more than twice in a season, voted through 161-7. Penn refused to comply, signed its own deal anyway, and within days, the NCAA declared Penn as a member in bad standing. The 4 schools due to play Penn that fall said they wouldn't take the field. Penn folded on July 19th. That's the whole machine. In year 1, a group of competitors agreed to sell their product as a single pool instead of individually. And the moment the single most viable member tries to leave and sell alone, the rest of the pool doesn't just argue, they punish them. That machine has been built twice since 1951 and collapsed twice, both times for the same reason. It's about to be built a third time, and this time the tool isn't a boycott, it's an act of Congress sitting on the floor of the US Senate as we speak. To understand whether it'll hold, you need to understand why the first 2 failed. Here's the thing the NCAA's own vote count doesn't quite explain. Television in 1951 was watched by almost nobody. There was maybe 10,000 sets in a range around any given campus. The NCAA's own television committee still reported to the 1951 convention that TV does have an adverse effect on college football attendance and threatens the national overall athletic and physical system. Language so dramatic enough that members of the school voted it through by roughly 90% 3 years running. The study that was supposed to back that claim was a National Opinion Research Center report. It was nearly 30 pages and roughly $50,000. Came out in 1952. The vote banning television happened in January of 1951. The evidence arrived 16 months too late, after the rule it was meant to justify. So the attendance argument came after the fact. What was actually driving it was a little more specific. Notre Dame had the only true national following in the sport. Its own radio and early TV deals reached more of the country than any conference could, and multiple accounts from the era describing the whole committee as existing in practice to stop one school from monetizing that reach alone. Notre Dame's president at the time actually agreed that the plan was illegal, calling it socialist in nature, to force his university to share its television revenue with everyone else. That's not a modern complaint. That's 1952. You'll hear the same objection, nearly word for word, from conference commissioners defending the current media money later in this video. Notre Dame didn't break the plan. It took the deal, 5 televised games in 1951, folded it fully into the NCAA package by 1952, and stayed inside the pool for another 40 years. The school the entire system was built to contain became, for 4 decades, one of the most cooperative members. Remember that. It matters later, because when Notre Dame finally does walk, the whole structure it walks out of collapses within 7 years. Skip ahead to 1978. By now, the NCAA has been running this pool for nearly 3 decades, selling one national television package on behalf of every Division I school, and a program director named Thomas Hansen writes an internal letter that decades later becomes Plaintiff's Exhibit 18 in federal court, because it shows in his own handwriting exactly how the price got set. Hansen starts from a number, ABC's guaranteed minimum payout for the year, just under $29 million. He subtracts the NCAA's own cut and some payoff money, leaving about $25 million to allocate. Then in his words, he worked various combinations of price per games and number of games until the math landed exactly on that number, regardless of which 2 teams were actually playing. Every national broadcast was $533,600. Every regional broadcast was $401,000. Oklahoma versus USC carried on 200 stations, paid the exact same as a game between Citadel and the Appalachian State, carried on 4. Same price, not because everyone thought those games were worth the same, because the whole system worked backwards from a target revenue number, then split it evenly. Cartels and cartel economies are big parts to the failures the NCAA had in the past. Let's quickly go over them. So in this hypothetical world, there was going to be 2 bakeries, a blue and a red one. This is the whole town. There's nowhere else to buy bread. Each bakery can make 10 loaves. That's 20 loaves for 20 customers. Note, each customer gains a different amount of utility per loaf. So this guy skipped breakfast. He'll pay $5 for a loaf. Most guys, closer to 2. This guy back here, he just ate $1 tops. When the 2 bakeries compete, they got 20 loaves to move, and they'll undercut each other to move them. To sell that very last loaf, somebody has to drop their price low enough to reach the barely hungry dollar guy in the back. So the price falls to $1. Everyone who wanted bread got bread. The bakers made an honest living. That night, the 2 bakers meet in the back and they make a deal. Instead of each making 10 loaves, let's just make 10 loaves total, 5 each, for the same 20 consumers. Watch what happens to the price. The bakers don't have to reach the dollar guy anymore in the back. There just isn't enough bread to even bother with him. They sell to the top 10 highest bidders and let the rest go hungry. The creep up, it jumps to $3, $4, same bread, half the quantity, and the bakers just made more money selling less. So who lost? Obviously, the 10 people still standing here holding their money who wanted bread and couldn't get it. Every one of these people who have gladly paid more than what it costs to bake a loaf, there was a deal to be made with every single one of them. A baker willing to sell, a customer willing to buy at a price that worked for both of them. The collusion killed those deals, not transferred them. Killed them. That bread never got baked. That money never changed hands, and nobody, not the consumer, not even the baker, ends up with it. For those 10 people standing there with cash and no bread, that's the deadweight loss in this scenario. When these 2 bakers collude, they also stop competing on quality. A beautiful loaf and a sad, flat one, it will cost the same price. Because why bother making a better loaf when you've agreed to not fight over the customers? Keep this in mind, because in a few minutes from now, you're going to see how the NCAA charged the exact same price for a game on 200 stations and a game on only 4, and you've already known exactly what you're looking at. A cartel is just a group of competitors colluding to act as if they were one company instead of competing, or a monopoly. That's exactly what the NCAA's plan was. Cap the quantity first, 1 national broadcast a week, blackouts on 3 of 10 Saturdays, 2 appearances per team, then set one price on whatever's left. Hanson's letter was the baker in the back, deciding how many loaves to bake. And this pricing mechanism left a fingerprint you can actually see in the numbers on top of the theory. From 1978 to 1981, the fee per broadcast barely moved. It was around $1.29 million. Then, in 1982, the NCAA added a second network to the package, and per broadcast fee roughly doubled to $2.1 million, for what was by definition a weaker right, since it was no longer exclusive. Add one more buyer to the market with no substitute product, and the price jumps even for less. That single data point is the best evidence in the whole case that college football had no real competition. There was nothing else a buyer could turn to instead. The NCAA's own leadership seemed to understand exactly what it looked like from the outside. 2 years before, Hanson's letter, in 1976, the head of the NCAA told a subordinate to stop describing these committees as something that sets fees and starts calling it something that merely recommends them. The court that eventually heard the case had a word for that instruction. It called it concealment. By 1981, 2 schools had had enough, Oklahoma and Georgia, both major football pros, both stuck selling through the same pool as everyone else. sued the NCAA for the right to negotiate their own television deals. The case went to a 9-day bench trial in 1982 in front of a federal judge in Oklahoma named Juan Burciaga. Antitrust law generally works one of two ways. Some business arrangements are considered so obviously anti-competitive that court won't even entertain a defense. That's called per se illegal. Everything else gets what's called a rule of reason analysis, where a court weighs an anti-competitive harm against whatever legitimate business justifications the defendant can offer. Judge Burciaga found the NCAA guilty under both standards. The appeals court agreed. When it finally reached the Supreme Court, the ruling wasn't the kind of restraint courts could ban automatically, because some cooperation between competing schools generally is necessary to have a sport at all. With that said, they struck them down anyway, because even under the most lenient standard, none of the NCAA's justifications held up. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in June of 1984. The plan raised prices and cut output, the two symptoms together that shows up specifically when a cartel is restricting quantity to protect its price, not when a product is simply in high demand. And none of that served anyone but the cartel itself. But there was a second, much smaller thread in that same opinion worth noting. A stray quote leading to the majority approving about the NCAA's role in preserving amateurism, a line that had nothing to do with the television rights, and that the court wasn't even being asked to rule on. That single line went on to shield the NCAA's rules against paying their athletes for the next 37 years, until a different case tossed it in 2021 and opened the door to the name, image, and likeness payments. It was the same ruling in both. They were both cartels. One just collapsed immediately while the other one took decades. Here's the part that might feel like a bit of a contradiction. In 1983, the final year of the NCAA's pool television deal, the total value of every college football broadcast in the country was roughly $69.7 million. In 1984, the first year where every school in the conference could sell their own rights independently, freely, and in a competitive nature, exactly what Oklahoma and Georgia sued for, the combined value of every deregulated broadcast deal fell to roughly $43.6 million, a 37% drop in the very first year of what essentially was freedom. Oklahoma and Georgia won their case and made way less money the next season. That's not the lawsuit failing or anything, that's just how powerful a cartel can be. When the cartel model works exactly as it does in theory, the entire point of a pooled deal that had to restrict their own output in order to inflate their per unit price, when you take away the restriction, and of course the price per game collapses. There's simply more football on television than there used to be, spread across more networks, none of them paying the artificial per broadcast premium anymore. To step back and kind of dissect the numbers a little bit, it can give you a better picture of the story going on, because it seems like the numbers are arguing with each other. A cartel doesn't just pick a high price, it picks a restricted quantity. Because scarcity is the only thing that lets a uniform high price hold in the first place. Every broadcast that ever existed, because of the weekly appearances cap and the Saturday blackouts, was a trade a network would have paid for, and the school would have gladly sold, at a price still well above what the cost is to put the game on air. Those games didn't just get discounted. They didn't happen at all. This is the deadweight loss the microeconomic theory predicts. So when the restrictions disappears and total industry revenue drops 37% in a single year, that's not the market getting worse or anything, that's just a deadweight loss being filled in. Where now that total output is higher, the actual number of televised games expanded, and the price per game broadcast fell towards what any individual game was really worth, instead of the backwards engineered number Thomas Hansen produced 6 years earlier. A smaller number of broadcasts sold at an inflated artificial price got replaced by a much larger number sold at a lower, more real one. Sellers collectively captured less monopoly rent. The sport collectively delivered more actual football to actual screens. Almost immediately after, the major football conferences rebuilt a version of the same pool. 60-some schools, everyone except the Big Ten and the old Pac-10, who'd sat out the NCAA's plan since the 1970s and kept selling on their own, formed something called the CFA, or the College Football Association. and sold their games as one collective package again. The same year, the Supreme Court had just ruled that kind of collective selling illegal. Now, it survived on a technicality in the first case that never fully closed. Whether a non-profit athlete association gets treated differently than a for-profit cartel, it lasted roughly 13 years. And I bet you can guess it ended exactly the way the first one did. In 1990, Notre Dame, the school the whole system was originally built to contain, announced it was leaving the CFA to sign its own 5-year deal, worth $38 million with NBC. This was just the beginning. 4 years later, the SEC followed, announcing its exit in February of 1994. A Dallas paper described the CFA as dead as a television entity the same day. The SEC turned around and signed its own 5-year deal worth $100 million with CBS. The CFA then shut down for good in 1997. Nobody sued him this time. Nobody had to. The organization that had been born from a defection in 1984 died from one in 1997. No courtroom was required this time, just the two most valuable members deciding they no longer needed the other 60. For the next 2 decades, the pattern that actually held was the boring one. Conferences, not national coalitions, became the unit of sale. 10, 12, 18 schools at a time, and those pools stayed stable because the gap in value between the biggest and the smallest member inside any one of those conferences was never that large. Nobody called the conference's television deal a cartel because nobody inside it had enough leverage to walk. Moving forward to 2007, the Big Ten did something structurally new. It launched its own television network. That mattered a lot more than you might think, because a cable network doesn't get paid by viewers who tune in. It gets paid a carriage fee by every cable subscriber in its footprint, whether they watch a single football game or not. A conference had effectively become a media company, and the asset that mattered wasn't about any fans, it was about how many households you're in. In 2012, the Big Ten added Reuters and Maryland. Commissioner Jim Delaney on camera the day of the announcement was fairly candid about the New York media market and was a big part of the appeal. The statistician Nate Silver ran the actual fan numbers that year and found Reuters and Maryland near the bottom of the conference in football following. Going back to what I just said, fans and the number of viewers didn't matter. It was just about reach and how many households you can fit in. So by that logic, each of those schools were just a steal. That system started to strain the moment cable itself started to shrink. Paid TV subscriptions in the country peaked at roughly 105 million households in 2010 and had fallen to about 43 million now. And yet, conference media deals have only gotten more valuable over that same stretch. The SEC's deal is worth roughly $3 billion now, and the Big Ten is roughly $7 billion. The reason is the same one from the 1982 trial, replaying with new players. Live sports became the last thing people still watch as it happens, and the number of companies willing to bid for that, like Amazon, Netflix, Apple, YouTube, alongside traditional networks, kept growing even as cable shrank. Now with more bidders, for a scarcer and scarcer kind of programming, still pushes the price. Exactly like adding a second network in 1982, doubled the fee for the weaker right. The clearest proof happened when it stopped working for the Pac-12. Its final TV offer from Apple would have paid based on actual subscriber demands, rather than guaranteed cable carriage fees. This is the first time where people would actually be willing to pay to watch a specific conference. This didn't happen, because 10 of the 12 schools didn't want to find out whether it would work or not. So by 2024, the conference was pretty much dead. And inside the conferences that did survive, something worth watching closely started happening. They quietly started paying more to their more valuable members. Since these conferences are nonprofits, we can look into their public tax returns. And buried in those filings, you can see the exact dollar amount each conference sent to each of their member schools. So looking into the tax returns for the past 4 years, we can see that production gap from operating in a cartel was now being taken up in the new free market. Let's look at the top and bottom of the ACC. Clemson pulls in roughly $55 million. SMU pulls in 17. That's more than a 3-to-1 spread inside of a single conference. In the same year, Now, part of that is due to entry terms. SMU agreed to take no media money for all of its first year as a way to buy in, and Stanford and Notre Dame all came in on reduced shares. But part of it is just strictly policy. The ACC recently rewrote its payout formula so that 60% of its television money is now split by 5-year viewerships, not evenly. The conference decided on purpose to pay its most watched schools more. Now watch what a conference that didn't make that choice looks like. The Big 12's legacy members are packed into a tight band. Everyone is within a few $1,000,000 of everyone else, right around 40 million. The only real gap is the 4 newest schools, still phasing its way in. No viewership formula or any tier system going on. It's all old-fashioned. Roughly equal pool. So here we have 2 conferences sitting side by side that have made opposite bets on how the pool should work. The ACC is more focused on paying out more to its bigger names in order to keep them from leaving, while the Big 12 is betting on treating everyone equally and splitting the profits more uniform. This will come back to how both are surviving right now. And the gap between the conferences dwarfs the gap inside of any one of them. In that same year, the SEC distributed over $1 billion to its schools. The Big 12 and the ACC, the 2 we just looked at, distributed a little over half that each. On a per school basis, the 2 richest conferences pay their members roughly double what the other 2 do. The nature of how the profits are distributed are what's actually keeping these conferences together. So currently there's 2 proposals floating around for the future of college football. But first, that amateurism field from 1984 finally fell in 2021 in a case called Alston. Within days, schools could pay their athletes for their name, image, and likeness. By 2025, college athletes can be directly paid up to a cap of around $20.5 million. In practice, that cap is more like a floor because top rosters are already spending more than $40 million. So where is this all going? In the fall of 2024, 2 pitches for the sports future surfaced within weeks of each other, both given to athletic directors. One named Project Rudy came from an ex-Disney executive, plus Jack Schwarbick, who co-designed the current playoffs, proposing a 70-team league with private capital behind it. The revenue generated from this league would be pooled and tiered based off of, well, whoever performed the best. The other proposal comes from a consultant, Len Perma. He proposed a cleaner break, a 136-school, football-only entity with collective bargaining. The Big 12 and some ACC presidents took those meetings in Dallas that December. The Big 10 and SEC and Notre Dame didn't show up at all, with the commissioner of the SEC, Greg Sankey, stated that he had no interest in some super league notion with 70 teams because those proposals just want to become the SEC. Big 10 commissioner Petiti, not sure how to say his name, made a similar point. He's seen nothing that any plan the Power 4 couldn't already do themselves. They aren't rejecting the idea of the Super League, they're rejecting the splitting of the proceeds with anyone that isn't already part of their powerful group. This should have some alarm bells ringing, since now you know back in 1952, Notre Dame did the same thing, Oklahoma in 1981, and of course Penn in 1950 where it all started. The most viable party in the group just declining to subsidize everyone else. So what the biggest conferences actually need isn't capital, it's protection from anyone forcing the alternative. And that's what the Protect College Sports Act applies. Underneath the athlete provisions, its business core does 2 things at once. It grants a limited antitrust exemption, which is simply legal permission for exactly the collective selling Oklahoma and Georgia sued over in 1981. And in the same bill, a Super League prohibition, credited to Senator Deb Fisher, bearing the kind of breakaway Project Rudy and the CSFL represented. So this allows the pooling rights if they wanted to take it, but then makes it illegal for anyone to leave and build a bigger pool. With that said, pooling isn't unanimous. It takes 75% of the 138 FBS schools to opt in. So even if the Big 10 and the SEC both refuse, the other schools clear that 75% benchmark on their own. The 2 most viable members can be pooled against their will essentially by the majority vote, which again should Sound familiar? Because this happened in 1951. The beneficiaries outvote the top, now restricted schools. It's kind of crazy how 75 years later, the same thing keeps happening. The ban is stranger still. Coming out of a committee, its threshold dropped to any conference over 700 million in revenue, which covers all 4 power conferences and freezes conferences memberships in place if the bill does pass. So the thing being sold as a Super League prohibition is closer to a freeze on the whole sport. Nobody moves, nobody merges, the board is locked in as is. So for most of 2026, the Big Ten and SEC fought this bill. They were the loudest opponents precisely because it would just keep them from exiting if they were voted in by the majority. Then over just one frantic week that took place in late July, with a Trump intervention and the Senate's clock running out, lawmakers rewrote it, and the 2 conferences flipped to now supporting it. So let's look what changed. So what they fought for was money and a loophole with the money. A 22.5 million player retention pool carved on top of the salary cap, protection for the outside name, image, and likeness spending that flows disproportionately into their programs, and language guarding their access to the playoffs. And regardless of how the vote goes, for the first time, the fight over whether college football gets a legal cartel isn't in the courtroom anymore. It's now stuck in Congress, where the schools that benefit have a vote on it. And private equity hasn't waited for any sort of ruling to get placed. Utah already sold a minority stake in a new for-profit entity handling the sponsorships and name, image, and likeness to an investment firm for over $400 million. The first deal of its kind in any athletic department. And the Big Ten spent 2025 negotiating for a $2.4 billion from the California Pension Fund for 10% of its new entity. Big Ten enterprises without payouts to schools ranging from about 100 million to over 150 million distributed unevenly. 16 of 18 schools backed it. Michigan and USC didn't. So the deal still remains paused. Now for the calendar. Nobody controls the calendar, but time's running out. The Big Ten's media deal runs through the 2029-2030 season. The Big 12's expires alongside it in 2030. The ACC's exit fees ends the season right after 2030-2031, and the playoff contract ends just after that 2031-32 season. Per Project Rudy's own target launch in 2031, every major contract in the sport comes loose within about 18 months of each other, except one. The SEC's ESPN deal runs until 2034, so if a breakaway happens, it forms around the Big Ten's freedom first, years before the SEC has any contractual reason to join it. So there's currently 3 number projections on the table. Let's take a look at them. First, Cody Campbell stated that
any plan that isn't exactly what they want to do has all these problems with implementation, or I don't believe the numbers. We say we can make an incremental $7 billion per year if we make some changes to the way we market our media rights. They say, well, I don't believe that. And I'll say, dude, look, we've got hard data. It's obvious, maybe you don't believe $7 billion, but we can definitely make a lot more money if we unify our media rights. And so why would you not want to do that other than just that you don't want to give up control?
$7 billion. The pool would add around $7 billion. And just to note, Campbell's own school is Texas Tech, which runs the largest name, image, and likeness payroll in the country, north of 50 million. Keep in mind this $7 billion is just a projection. There's nothing really backing it, and that will continue. Because the next number is $10.5 billion, the counter from the Big Ten and SEC, who says they'll compete with Campbell's pool without pooling by 2036. They assume that current college football value would continue to grow at the same rate. They call Campbell's figure not supported by any empirical evidence. Finally, $15 billion, projected by Project Rudy, and credit where it's due, there is a little bit more work behind this one. By first cutting 18% of games against weak opponents and stacking bigger schools against each other, you can see how more money could be driven through Project Rudy. So Let's look at the assumptions beneath this first. Right. Networks will pay double or triple current rates. So conveniently, the model projects a revenue increase of exactly 25 million per school. The precise figure, by the way, that schools now owe athletes under the new law. So we have three parties, three numbers, billions of dollars, and nobody really showed their work, with none of it being testable until 2030. Here's a pattern that continues to repeat itself. Plainly, a coalition is only as strong as its most profitable members are willing to share. Pooling doesn't fail necessarily. Pooling across real value gaps is what causes the failure. Every time. The pools that survived were small and roughly equal, or by paying their bigger names more money, like we saw with the Big Ten's half shares for the newcomers, the ACC's viewership weighted 60%, the playoffs now sending 59% of its money to two conferences, and unequal sharing isn't the exemption anymore, it's just what's keeping these pools from collapsing. What the Protect College Sports Act is attempting is something no pool in 80 some years has been able to pull off, which is to hold a group together across a growing value gap. And not necessarily by paying more to their top teams, the way it's worked in the past, somewhat, but by law, with the exits welded shut and the map frozen where it stands. History's answers to this is that every time the party worth the most will eventually leave and take the money with it. So the question for whoever's still in that room in 2031 when the calendar clears isn't whether Congress can pass the law that says you can't leave, it's whether the conferences worth the most have finally lost the ability to leave without each other for the first time in this sport's history, or whether, like every party before them, they're just waiting for their own contract to expire. I've been Espan Reyes. Thanks for listening.